Welcome to the Zoffee for Monday, June 8th, and today we're going to be talking to Richard Adamson, and he's the CEO of Industrial Climate Solutions out of Calgary. We're going to be talking about carbon capture and storage. So welcome to the Zoffee, Richard.
No, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Now, as I mentioned to you when I interviewed you a couple of months ago, I don't know much about carbon capture and storage, though I do know more now after I interviewed you. But nevertheless, this is a topic that doesn't get a lot of media attention. So why don't we start out? Could you give us a brief overview of what it is and where we're at in the technology and the process?
Well, first off, carbon capture and storage is a term I absolutely abhor because it bundles a whole geology and chemistry, and it just bundles a really awkward swatch of different types of technologies together and tries to call it one thing. But really what it is there are a number of processes that emit a lot of CO2, big industrial, large stationary emissions, and that's emitters and that sort of thing. And it makes a lot of sense to capture that CO2 at the source. And there's a stack of different technologies that can be used for that. Then you got to move the CO2 from there to some place where you can put it away, either by converting it to some kind of a product, injecting it underground to store for a long period of time, and hopefully figure out how to make all of the economics on that whole package work. So some of that looks like enhanced oil recovery, some of it looks like conversion to products, but basically that end-to-end process is what's referred to as carbon capture and storage. CCUS is the carbon capture utilization and storage is the term they use a lot more now because there's so much focus on what can you do with the CO2 other than just store it.
Well, my introduction to CCUS was SaskPower's Boundary Dam project a few years ago. And if I recall correctly, in our last interview, you said that it cost SaskPower, the cost to SaskPower was $115 a ton. And those costs have now dropped considerably, I think down to $40 a ton. Am I in the range here?
Yeah, so we need to be clear here. So carbon capture and storage is not one thing. And what matters a huge amount is what are you capturing the CO2 from? It's hard to capture CO2 from a coal-fired power plant because there's so much other garbage in the emissions. And so there's a whole bunch of effort. You have to clean it up. You have to get rid of all of the sulfur. You have to get rid of this. You can't have the particulates. So by the time you get to the actual CO2 capture part, you've spent a whole bunch of money on equipment to get all of the other garbage out of the flue gas stream. So I regard capture off of coal-fired power plants is a really tough thing. So there's dollars per ton and dollars per ton, and you need to be careful not to merge too many things. So yes, the capture off coal-fired power plants, yeah, it depends on who you talk to, is reduced by 30 or 40% since the Boundary Dam situation. But there's a lot of industrial sources that are a lot easier to capture CO2. One of the big factors is how much CO2 is in the flue gas. So if you're capturing CO2 off of a natural gas power plant, it's maybe 4 or 5% CO2. Off the coal-fired power plant, it's about 12. Off of a common hydrogen conversion process in a refinery, maybe 20% or more, depending on the package. And every time, if you can picture kind of on that 20% case, picture a glass of water. So that's pure air. Now, flue gas coming out of if you were trying to pull the CO2 out of something like the emissions from a gas-fired power plant, it would be like one drop of ink for every 25 drops of water. So it wouldn't look very dilute, very dark. And you can imagine catching the ink out of that would be difficult. if you're dealing with something like an industrial process where it's 20 or 25% CO2, that's 1 drop of ink, 4 drops of water. So that's going to be really dark, and the amount of energy required to capture a bunch of CO2 out of that is going to be a lot lower. So the range of different processes make a big difference. So that's why I really emphasize. So when you're talking about 45%, $45 per ton capture, that's from high concentration, relatively from benign applications. So I tend to, unfortunately, carbon capture and storage has mostly been applied, or was mostly hypothetically applied, for coal-fired power, and it was all about this clean power and that sort of thing, clean coal, and that's been a distraction. It's industrial that I think is where it's really important.
Well, that's really interesting, because industrial, of course, creates a lot of the GHG emissions. Doesn't maybe get a lot of attention. So where are we at with the industrial applications? Because, and then again, that's also, as I understand it, a very difficult industry, or difficult sector in which to reduce emissions, because they often require, plants require a lot of heat, and which means burning something to create the heat. So where are we at with that technology, and if we're looking at $45 a ton now, where are we likely to get in the next, say, 2 to 5 years in terms of cost?
Well, we're at a really exciting point. In fact, just about a week ago, a major announcement happened in Alberta, where the Redwater refinery, which is doing CO2 capture, was just commissioned, and the carbon trunk line and the enhanced oil recovery, the enhanced energy oil EOR project, that whole chain is now a functioning integrated carbon management system. That's really exciting, because to me, the question really isn't carbon capture and storage. It's how do we manage carbon emissions in an industrial context? And we have to start looking at systems as opposed to a source, a pipe, and a sink. It has to be, how do we manage the carbon? So here's part of the issue. Industrial heat is a big problem because of all of the emissions from all of the different heat sources. But then there's other industrial processes that have emissions that is more than just because of burning fuel to make heat. It's like cement processing or production and other things, whereas CO2 is a byproduct of the actual process. So something like cement requires capture straight on the stack. There's nothing else you're going to be able to do, because it's not just the heat source. There's some interesting opportunities around industrial heating, though, because if you've got a large enough source, it might make sense to put capture on the stack above your boiler or your whatever, or it might make sense to convert natural gas to hydrogen, capture the CO2 at that point, and then send the hydrogen out to all of your different industrial heat sources. So there's a couple of different ways you can do it. So if you can, sometimes it's a matter of scale. It's hard to make cost-effective capture on small sources, but you can do capture on a big hydrogen conversion, and then deal with all of those sources with one capture point.
Now, I know when the questions open up, our friend Maggie Hanna is going to ask a question about sequestering carbon from hydrogen production. So let's address that now. Because that seems sensible to me. You do it in one place, probably economies of scale, lower costs, more efficiencies. Where are we at with that idea of creating blue hydrogen from natural gas and then sequestering the carbon?
Well, there's always, it's whack-a-mole. There's always multiple problems. As soon as you solve one problem, somebody will say, yes, but there's another emission source over here you've got to deal with. You deal with that. These are not legitimate objections to going ahead. It's that you do a great job on one, and you suddenly, something else becomes visible that wasn't visible before. So people raise the objection around blue hydrogen that, well, there's emissions associated with production of natural gas. We got to deal with that too. But if we can deal with the emissions at the conversion point, that's a huge chunk. That's a huge step forward. So there's multiple different pathways, and all of them legitimately get you to blue hydrogen. So first off, to define blue hydrogen, there's green hydrogen and blue hydrogen. Green hydrogen assumes that you're starting from renewable electricity, and then you're using some kind of electrolysis process to produce the hydrogen. So there's, in theory, no emissions associated with the whole chain. With blue hydrogen, you're starting with natural gas. You convert the you capture the hydrogen off the natural gas, and then you extract the carbon either into CO2 for carbon capture and storage, or in some cases you convert the carbon to other carbon products, carbon powder or something. But the idea is you separate out the carbon from the hydrogen, and then you've got a clean burning heat source, and you've prevented the CO2 or the carbon from getting into the atmosphere.
What's preventing us from moving ahead with blue hydrogen on a big scale? And I know Maggie will argue that this is a huge opportunity and we should be, pursuing it in a very significant way. So what are some of the, maybe the top couple of technical challenges around capturing carbon from the blue hydrogen process?
I would say that the question isn't the right question. There are no technical challenges. The challenges are not technical. The challenges have to do with structuring business cases appropriately, around incentives being structured appropriately. Here's my approach is that we really have to be looking at carbon management from a systems approach. We've been treating it as a bunch of projects. We're going to do a CCS project. Here's our source. Here's our pipe. Here's our hole in the ground. That's a project. Let's move on and do another project. It's the wrong way to do things, and it's like I'm going to deal with my city sewage system by building a lot of outhouses. That's not a viable approach. So we really need to be looking at how do we put an integrated system together that manages business risk, technical risk, and reduces the kind of the overhead burden associated with things like infrastructure costs, gathering systems, or whether it's hydrogen pipelines or CO2 pipelines. All of those things are basically infrastructure costs, and we need to figure out how to share those out and amortize them over, long periods of time. It's a utility problem, it's a business structure problem, and it's a policy and regulatory problem. The technical part is easy.
Okay, that actually makes a lot of sense to me. So how much progress have we made on fixing the regulatory problem, the policy problem, the business case problem? Are we in the infancy, just at the beginning? Are we midway? We're making some progress, but we're not quite there yet? Or are we close to actually solving this puzzle?
I think we're quite close. So in Alberta, when we did these demonstration projects, like them or love or hate them, the big injections of capital into CCS demonstrations, Shell Quest and the others. In order to the really important part of this that nobody really saw or paid attention to in the press was that there was this huge effort underneath that required to put the policy and regulatory regime in place that says, so who owns the pore space in the rocks underground? Who's going to own the liability 50 years down the road after everybody else? Those questions were critical before the projects could even be considered to go ahead. And we did that. All of that's been addressed in Alberta. So that there's this, we led the world in that, and what we did here is being used as an example all around the world. So that doesn't get enough credit. So
well,
that side,
Richard, I want to jump in here because this is news to me, and I report on this area, and I've never heard this before. So if we've done something that is no one else in the world has done, it would seem to me that gives Alberta a competitive advantage, a first mover advantage. And how do we capitalize on that? And are we prepared to, are we thinking about, moving more quickly to capitalize on it?
I wouldn't say nobody else in the world has done that. When we did it, nobody else in the world had done it. A lot of people have learned from that and moved ahead, while we've sat still and not advanced since those initial demonstration projects. But that gives us a great place to build from. Down in the States, there's been some really good policy things that have been done. And some people may find this strange, but some of the best climate policy is coming in under the current regime down in the States. And that is a thing called 45Q, a tax credit for CO2 either sequestered or used in enhanced oil recovery, which basically is a bounty on tons of CO2 removed from the carbon cycle. And that's a great way to do things for a couple of reasons. Politically, it's really hard to invest taxpayer money in capital projects and absorb all of that risk up front. But to say, all right, I'll pay you a bounty for your success in removing tons, and you only get paid when a ton gets pulled out of the cycle. Industry, go out and figure out the most cost-effective way to do it. You take on the technical risk. If it fails, it's on you. Only if you're successful do we pay, and the taxpayers are picking up the tab for that. That makes a lot more sense. And that structure is creating a little mini carbon rush in the US around carbon capture projects, enhanced oil recovery projects, and that sort of thing. And there's a growing movement in Canada that we should put something similar in place up here, because that creates the pull that gets a lot of these other pieces and parts. It starts making more sense to have the pipelines in place. It starts making more sense to put the capture projects in place, or the using enhanced oil recovery in the fields or whatever. So it's an incentive in the right direction that's really technology neutral, and it only funds success, which
right. So if we're talking about doing this in Canada, is this another case where each province is going to pursue the policy framework and the initiatives on their own, or is there some role for the federal government in coordinating these so that we actually have a national approach to this?
Well, you're talking to the wrong person about how. I'm not a political science major, and I really don't want to get too far down that road, because I'm sure I'll stick my foot in my mouth. But really, the outcome that's necessary is that the rules have to be the same or very, very similar across the entire country, so that industry can say, all right, we can put a plan in place. We understand how to make the investments here. We don't have to learn a totally new policy regime every time we cross borders. Some of the most frustrating effects have been things like the inability to transfer carbon credits between provinces. So a project where an Alberta industrial is willing to fund a carbon storage project in BC won't go ahead because they can't get the carbon credits back into Alberta and take advantage of them. Those kinds of things, which are real examples and have blown up really legitimate projects in the past. We have to stop that nonsense.
Now, this is going to be my last question, Richard. So if everybody could get their questions together and put up your little blue hand, that would be great. So, Richard, I'm fond of saying that the 2020s is going to be a really disruptive decade. This is the decade when a lot of these new energy technologies begin to take off. They begin to really have an effect on the existing fossil fuel infrastructure and our national and regional economies. Sort of buckle up, folks. 2020s is going to be a rough ride, or an interesting ride. Can we say that about carbon capture and storage? Is it ready to play in the game at that disruptive level?
Yeah, I would say in a word, yes, but we really ought to be thinking about it in terms of carbon management, industrial carbon management systems, rather than carbon capture and storage technologies. And we have the opportunity, we're this close, and certainly in Alberta and in perhaps in some other areas, we're this close to being able to put into place integrated carbon management systems that makes Alberta a really attractive place to invest in building chemical plants, fertilizer plants, all of these things that use natural gas as feedstock, but are, if I'm in Singapore and I'm deciding I want to invest $5 billion in a new chemical plant somewhere in the world, it's going to have a 30-year life. And I don't know how the rules on climate are going to change over that 30-year period. I better build it someplace where I know we can physically mitigate that carbon risk, and I'm not getting hung out to dry someplace on a change of rules. So if we've got the ability to physically deal with the emissions, and we have the natural gas resources and other natural resources, we should be able to attract industrial investment from around the world as being one of the most attractive places, so that you can actually go and sell your product as a low emissions product anywhere in the world. This is the opportunity that I see for us in terms of the next wave of prosperity in Alberta.
Now, one of the reasons why I really enjoy doing these Zoffies is because we very often, many of our attendees have a technical background and ask great questions. And one of those is Dave Patterson, who will be up first. And he's a former electrical engineer for Suncor, and I always ask good questions. So Dave, if you can unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Hi, good information. I'm wondering what systems and processes are in place or going to be put in place to prevent, down the road leakage from the CO2 storage cavern, the CO2 pipeline, the wells where they pump them full of CO2 for enhanced recovery. What's to prevent it just from leaking out over decades later on?
Okay, so there's a couple of things. Reservoirs are not caverns. So it's generally a porous rock formation like sandstone or something like that. So the people have in mind that it's like a big, like a champagne bottle, and we're shoving all this CO2 into it, and the cork's going to come out, and it's all going to come out. It's not like that. It's a sponge-like rock where it stays in place. Secondly, there's a huge amount of effort put into measurement, monitoring, and verification, and making sure that things during that initial decades, that stuff is actually staying where it's being put. The other aspect is that what happens over time is, so the CO2 is dissolved in some kind of brine usually. So it's in a liquid form, and it starts to react with the rock. So over a period of, depending on the rock, decades to centuries, it winds up being bonded in as a mineral form. So it's not actually in a releasable gas form over time once it stayed there. So the example that Stuart Hazeldine out of Edinburgh University uses is, we do a really bad job of communicating this as geologists and geoscientists. I'm an electrical engineer, but often it's said that over a 10,000 year period, or over a 10,000 year period of time, there's a 50% chance that 90% of the CO2 will remain in place, and people just sort of look at you blankly and say, "What the hell?" He said, what we need to be saying is it's 10,000 times more secure than growing trees.
Interesting. Okay. The next up is Tony Blake, who works for an environmental remediation company. I think that's right, Tony. Anyway, if you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
My question isn't directly related to energy. I blundered into a thing on the internet a few weeks ago about producing cement, how much of a contribution that has to CO2 production. But there was also a new technology brought forward in the same article called CO2 encrete, where how you bake the carbon dioxide out of limestone. This process puts it back in again to make kind of artificial limestone. It seems to have huge potential, and it seems to have application in Alberta because we produce a lot of cement too. Any comments about that?
Well, there's a number of different pathways that use variations on that theme in terms of reducing emissions from concrete. And cement is the stuff that sticks the concrete together, all the sand and gravel. But the cement, making the cement, you're right, there's there's a huge amount of emissions from that. First off, you have to heat it up. So there's the fuel input costs. But even if you can use something that is non-emitting for the fuel input costs, there's a huge amount that's just a matter of driving the CO2 off the limestone. And so what you do, if you can capture that CO2 that's coming off the limestone and sequester it in some way, that's great. If you can sequester it by actually bonding it into the cured concrete at the end, bonus. If you store it down underground, that's great. If you can convert it into something else, that's fine too. But the point really is with cement, and there is so much cement production that you need to, once you capture that CO2, you need to do something with it. And I'm all for any one of those pathways. None of them, I think, have proven at scale in terms of the mineralization side of remineralizing it back into the cement. Those things have been proven conceptually in an experimental kind of bench level. I don't know that that level without getting into details, there's a couple of really exciting things that have been going on that that do scale but don't have large enough CO2 absorption in them. But they're all interesting. I think we should be pursuing all of the above. None of them have been proven at massive scale.
Valley of Death.
Okay, thanks,
exactly.
Tony. Dave, you're up next. If you can unmute your mic and ask your question.
Sure. Thanks, Markham. Great talk. Thanks a lot. What's the energy cost in producing blue hydrogen? I mean, hydrogen is this incredibly energy dense fuel, 3 times, well, more than that, like 5 times jet fuel's energy density. So what is the actual energy cost of taking, you know, natural gas, which has a certain amount of energy we can get from it, to producing the blue hydrogen, please? Thanks.
Who cares? Is my answer is energy is not the issue. We have massive quantities of natural gas underground that in a carbon emissions constrained world, we will not be able to access unless we can eliminate the emissions. So the problem isn't the energy penalty. In fact, the problem is we're going to have locked in energy underground that we can't make any economic use of unless we address the carbon emissions. So we need to stop thinking. In fact, energy efficiency is irrelevant. Now that's a pretty challenging thing. Energy efficiency is irrelevant. What matters is, can you produce an energy carrier, hydrogen or ammonia or alcohol or something, but can you produce a non-emitting energy carrier that can be effectively used and economically used? So what matters is economics and emissions. The energy in terms of overall really doesn't matter if your economics and your emissions can be dealt with. And that's going to require a real change in thinking. But right now, we're at risk of having massive quantities of natural gas resources that have zero economic value because we haven't addressed the carbon emissions.
Okay, Dave Patterson, I'm going to skip over you since you've asked the question already and go right to Russell Ozen. So Russell, another engineer. Well, we seem to have a lot of them here today. Russell, if you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please. Oh, and we've lost.
Hi. Oh, no, I'm still here. Just had a question in terms of government policy offerings. If you could come up with the 3 or 4 bullet points you would place on a PowerPoint presentation to government officials in terms of altering their policies to promote the carbon capture process, what would those bullet points be?
Well, first off, I would suggest that they need to start framing their policies in terms of carbon management systems, as opposed to one element of the system being the carbon capture and storage package. The best thing that they could put in place is a bounty on carbon. It might be a tax credit like the 45Q in the States. It might take some other form, but a bounty on tons removed from the carbon cycle creates the pull that's going to drive the innovation that's going to solve a lot of those problems. So, and it's also the most politically palatable kind of policy structure. It's least likely to cause pitchforks in the streets, because you're not asking people to take a whack of risk right up front, or a whack of make a large investment up front. It's only paying for success. So those are really the 2 points. I don't know what number 3 would be.
Richard, is it fair to say, based on what you said this morning, that the Q45 approach is the carrot, whereas the carbon price approach is the stick?
Yeah, well, that's true. The straight up carbon price actually is really bad industrial policy. So a price on carbon, like a carbon tax, that's a good way to mop up the stuff around the edges, the things. What started as the specified gas emitters regulation and has gone through various iterations over time in Alberta was actually a brilliant piece of policy for industrial emitters, because instead of taxing every ton of CO2 that gets emitted, it puts a high penalty on the margin, the top marginal emissions. So here's your standard emissions, however you calculate what standard means, and any emissions above that you get hit really hard for, and the ones below that you don't. What that means is if you're not performing up to standard, then it's really worth putting money into solving your emissions problems on that top. Now, of course, over time, you want to have the band tighten in terms of what's marginal. And so you need to be able to have that progressing over time. That's a brilliant piece of policy for large stationary emitters. And we set the pace on that. We were the first province in Canada to have a price on carbon for that. And that is a model that I think we ought to be looking at nationally in terms of stationary emitters.
Great. Okay, Maggie, who is a geologist, you're up next, please.
Thanks, Richard. That's awesome. I want to ask a question. I don't know if you can answer it, but I'm wondering, what our capacity is in Alberta for CCS. Like, how much CO2 do we have? Do our rocks have capacity to receive in Alberta? Any idea?
Yes, I have an idea, and I'm going to be pulling a number off the top of my head, which is really dangerous, but it's something in Alberta.
Actually going to be inhibited by hair, so it'll
yeah.
go.
No, that won't get in the way. If you think about the total emissions for Canada, greenhouse gas emissions for Canada,
yeah,
and you were somehow magically to be able to capture all of the emissions from Canada and inject it underground in Alberta, we'd be able to do that for about 1,000 years.
Holy.
And that's using only conventional types of CO2 storage. There's some really exciting stuff that the Containment and Monitoring Institute guys at CMC are working on that is a whole other class of types of storage that might open up, especially in northern Alberta, some other possibilities. So there's Alberta, the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin that stored all of that carbon for all of those years, has a huge amount of capacity to store even more carbon should we choose to use it that way.
Great. Brian Heidecker, you're up next, and if you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Well, actually, my question got answered in that, but just for verification, the price in the U.S. is $45 a ton on that bounty. Is that
no?
Correct?
45Q is the tax code number. It's $35 a ton, if I remember correctly, for CO2 used for enhanced oil recovery, and this is just U.S. and U.S. $50 a ton for deep sequestration or deep storage. are the numbers they've used down there. And that's stackable with other benefits like low carbon fuel standards and things like that. So you combine that with the California low carbon fuel standard, and that's about in the range of $200 US a ton for CO2 storage.
And I'm assuming that's a short ton, Venus, it's the US.
I don't get me. I don't know that I could for sure say that.
Okay.
Before we get to Matthew Klippenstein, I want to make just a quick observation, which is that we generally think of the US as being a laggard in climate policy because there's a lot of rhetoric around that. The federal government has not moved in the last 4 years in that direction. But they're behind the scenes in many of these kinds of initiatives like Richard is talking about, and then at the state level, like California, there's a tremendous amount of work being done in climate mitigation and emission reduction and implementing climate policy. And I think there's a real lack of understanding in Canada just how much work the US is doing in these various areas, even without leadership out of the White House. So Matthew Klippenstein, another engineer, if you would unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Super, thanks. I guess I haven't shown my video, but I'll turn on so people can hopefully see vaguely what I look like. Yeah, so I had a question. Then in Alberta, there's a company, CanCarb, which uses natural gas pyrolysis to produce carbon black. At the moment, they don't capture the hydrogen for heat. So I'm just curious, this is very slightly off topic, but this could be a way of sequestering, in a sense, the carbon into a physical solid product. You don't even have to pump it underground. And would that be a path, perhaps, for large-scale use of Alberta's natural gas resources, where you could monetize the product perhaps better or more easily than as a fuel for a higher value, while basically not engendering sort of capture and sequestration costs because it's solid. Thanks.
Yeah. So first off, there's all kinds of these different pathways, and yes, there's this really. It would be a really inefficient way of generating hydrogen because they actually burn the hydrogen as part of their process, just as a fuel. Yes, you're right, but even more interestingly, the National Energy Technology Labs down in the States, NETL, has got a much more effective way of producing hydrogen and carbon black as a byproduct, and I'm quite interested to see how that scales. Again, the scalability question is always a challenge, but it's looking very, very good. And yes, that concept makes all kinds of sense. The process that they're using down there, their whole objective was to make carbon black, so they really didn't care about being able to do anything else very well. There are other processes coming along in their wake that I think will do a better job of that. Oh, by the way, all of that benefit, all of that great work, Markham, that's going on down in the States, just don't call it climate.
Understood. I will edit myself in the future to make sure I don't do that. So, Dr. Joe Vipond, you're up next. This will be our last question, by the way. So, Joe, if you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Hey, Joe.
I know you were saying that you had some doubts about the coal component of carbon capture, and we're talking a little bit about Boundary Dam. And I think, Markham, it was you that said that the prices was down around $40 a ton. My sense is that we don't really know what's going on because it's Sask Power, it's a Crown corporation. They don't have to really release their numbers, and I don't think they've released anything substantial in the last year or so, and they certainly were having some problems early on. Do you have a sense as to where the project is at as far as costs go and percent of emissions that are being captured?
I believe their capture levels are north of 90% on the unit that they're capturing from. Yeah, I think they've addressed their technical issues. The first of a kind plant is always going to have engineering challenges, and some of their engineering challenges related to just how nasty the emissions are from coal-fired power plants and how much stuff they had to do before they could get to the CO2. So in terms, and I would, the point I made was that that $40 or $45 a ton is probably not applicable to coal-fired power. It's applicable to other industrial capture processes, but coal-fired power, I think, they may be closer to 60 or 70 in that range is probably reasonable. The reason I don't put too much emphasis, there's going to be coal-fired power. It'll make sense to do capture at coal-fired power on certain situations. And the emissions from a coal-fired power plant, because they've had to deal with all of the garbage up front before they even do the CO2 capture, the emissions are actually really clean when they do a CO2 capture project. The problem is there are so many other ways to make power other than burning coal to me, there's two things that have to happen. You have to be able to reduce or eliminate substantially all of your emissions, and you have to be cost competitive. And the cost of renewables and other types of power is just, it's going to be really hard because of the complexity of what you have to do on a coal-fired power plant to do capture, to be able to compete widely globally on it. There will always be certain places where it makes sense to do coal with capture, but I tend to look at coal and capture as having been more about promoting the interests of coal-fired power, and that's fine. If they can do it and do it cost competitively, I got nothing against it. But my interest in terms of impact and where we're investing our time and effort, it's on the industrial side. I think the industrial side, there's products and processes that make stuff that we need all around the world that can't be done with wind turbines. They have to be done using those chemical processes or whatever. It's like making cement or whatever. There's emissions associated with these processes, and we have to figure out how to address the emissions and still get the stuff that people want into their hands.
Dave, thank you very much for this. Sorry, Joe, thanks for your question. Richard, thank you very much for doing this. We're going to wrap up now. Fascinating insight into this topic, and we broached lots of technical issues that if you don't mind, I'm going to follow up with interviews in the future, because I think this is something that our readers are really interested in. So, Richard, thank you very much for coming out today.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Markham.